So today I'm delighted to have Katie Lloyd Thomas with me. Katie Lloyd Thomas is a professor of theory and history in the School of Architecture at Newcastle University. And she's an author of a forthcoming book that addresses the question of Simondon. Um, Katie, it's great to see you. Let me put up onto the screen the book itself so we can see what we're talking about. Um, so, what is so unusual about this book is that it engages with Simondon in the
Mhm.
context of architectural specifications. Perhaps I could ask you first of all just to explain to those not familiar with the term what are architectural specifications?
Okay, it's a good question. So maybe the easiest way to think about the architectural specification is there are usually two documents, sets of documents that come to describe a building before it's built. One are the drawings, which describe the kind of the form and the extent of the building using geometry. And then there's also a written document, which gives the materials and sometimes the quality of workmanship. And in fact, that written document, the specification, vastly predates the drawing and has been much more prevalent because, of course, listing the building materials that you're going to use and pricing them is very important before you start any building work. So they've changed a lot over the centuries. They're different between different building cultures and across time as well. But yeah, so it's a very loose definition. But basically, that written set of of details for the materials of building.
Okay, great. I should say that Building Materials is going to be published on the 16th of December by Bloomsbury in London. So the interesting thing and the intriguing thing about this book is that the title refers to specifications as though it's going to be addressing one of the more mundane, well, to some people anyway, the more mundane aspects of the architectural office, and yet it is ultimately a book about theory. Why bring in a philosopher to address specifications?
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's very mute. The cover is very mute, and the title doesn't give anything away that this is very much a book about Gilbert Simondon. Um, but indeed, you're right, it is. And I think in a way, I would, I'm not sure that it is a book about specifications, although it does use the specifications. And maybe the most useful way to think about it is that my interest really my interest really was in a different kind of question. And the question really was, how do we think about building materials outside a concept of matter? Matter doesn't seem to be a very useful concept with which to think building materials, or perhaps materials in all sorts of other practices as they are kind of used and mobilized. So that's really the starting point for the book. And and in fact, it emerged quite early on when I was looking at feminist theory and psychoanalysis and started thinking about building materials more generally, and indeed particularly like in relation to the work of Jennifer Bloomer and Catherine Ingraham all those years ago when I was doing the masters at Nottingham with you, Neil. So and and I started engaging, first of all, with the specification because it quite late on in responding to the question, because it affords a set of descriptions of materials, and those descriptions, I argue, aren't conceptually the same. So sometimes materials are just named. Sometimes they're described in terms of the processes through which they come into being, and more in more contemporary times, they're described through performance. So it's all about what they do rather than what they are or how they're made. Um, and I suppose so I got to this kind of point with thinking about these of these as just as literally as different concepts for building materials. And I think it was through John Protavi's book, Political Physics. I read something about Simondon, and this is quite some time ago. This is sort of yeah, mid 2000s, maybe 2005, something like that. And and what interested me first about Simondon was just a critique of hylomorphism. So I could start to think about this kind of problem of matter on the form matter binary in architecture. But when I started reading the first chapter of the book on individuation, which was translated, of course, that's the chapter where Simondon describes the moulding of the wet clay brick. And what was really striking was how similar it was to a set of specifications for casting concrete that I was reading. They were from the 1930s, so for some modernist houses in the UK. And I suppose that's what started me off engaging with Simondon. But finally, the engagement went much further than that. So as I started to read more and more, and I think in the first place, what Simondon gives us is an account of, or the possibility of thinking ontogenetically. So thinking about the becoming of entities coming into being. So that was useful to start to move away from thinking about materials as substance and start to think about their coming into being. So I think of the book as a kind of ontogenetic inquiry. Second, he sort of provides an account of the technical object, and the book argues really that we think of materials as technical objects. And third, and this is perhaps a more kind of complicated bit of the argument, he focuses on the mediations which are made possible through individuation. So individuation is also a mediation, a coming into relation, and that was extremely important for the way that I built the theory of building materials, arguing, for example, that there might be a relationship between the wet concrete and the formwork that's made possible through a set of preparations, but similarly another set of preparations might make it possible for a piece of performance engineered glass to have a relationship with a particular security threat in a country. So the sort of the engagement with Simondon just kind of complexified. And maybe the final thing to say as well is I think that Simondon gives us a kind of proposal for something called transductive thought. And transductive thought is an idea that problems come into being through the process of the thought and the thing that we think them with. And in that way, I suppose I don't think of what I've done with Simondon's philosophy as applying Simondon's philosophy to the specification, but rather that through thinking the specification and Simondon's work together, a set of questions or possibilities kind of come into being, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
No, I think it's clear that Simondon is capturing the imagination of a number of architectural theorists right now, which is intriguing. But I guess the question I would have is, but why has he been overlooked for so long?
Well, I think it probably took me an extra year doing my PhD because I had to read Simondon in French. So at that time, there was a couple of translations around on the internet. Taylor Adkins' book's only just come out. So of course, it's made it much easier now that it's in English. I mean, there was when I started, there was some interest because of Deleuze and Guattari using his idea of the pre-individual. So there was already, and in France, there was already some commentaries, and the two commentaries in English, which were really fantastic, were one by Adrian Mackenzie called Transductions, Bodies at Speed, and also Alberto Toscano's Theatres of Production. So there were these couple of books that were there. And I think, yeah, people like Lars Voybreck were already looking at Simondon and interested in him, particularly to think about kind of emergent behaviours, but not, I think, in the way that I was engaging with him. so I think there's some, so I suppose those are the reasons in a way why the interest has been slow to pick up. And I'm sure that that he's now, of course, not just that it's translated, but also, I mean, this, enormous sort of body of work around living systems. I think he's been kind of very important for that, for cybernetics, for questions around iterative forms of making, so particularly around digital making. Some of the most interesting stuff, the things that I find the most interesting are sort of where Simondon's been picked up for thinking about kind of inventive or iterative ways of making, where maybe the relationship between the maker and the designer has been altered. So a fantastic PhD that I read by Helena Westerlind, for example, at KTH about digital printing with concrete, for example. But I suppose, so there are lots of interesting ways that it's being read at the moment, that Simondon's being used. But I think for me, the most important reason that architects need to read him is his argument about technology and technical activity as being central to culture, so that in general it's disregarded in the way I think architects tend to relegate the technical to the sort of, the underside of architecture. It's outside sort of architecture proper, architecture discourse. And it seems to me that there are sort of two reasons it's really important that we attend to the technical. And the first is that's actually where huge changes are happening. And if you believe, as I do, that concepts get formed, through production and technical practices, we need to be looking at those and not have them kind of, bite us on the back or not even see them. And I think, and the other reason is, I think, because of this account he gives of the possibilities for different ways of working with technology, so that there might be inventive or iterative ways of working rather than kind of alienated forms of working. And for me, that's again why it's so important that architects start to engage with the technical.
Great. I mean, I think this book is probably going to be something of a catalyst in terms of kind of opening up the world towards the thinking of Simondon. And it seems to me that there is definitely a kind of a gathering of a number of different minds all looking at the same French philosopher. So hopefully we're going to see a whole new chapter of thinking about materials in a radically different way based on this kind of work. So we look forward to seeing the launch of this book. It's coming out, just to repeat, it's coming out with Bloomsbury and published in London, who published Harry Potter, and also I would say my own book on AI, which is coming out also on the 16th of December.
On the same day. Beautiful.
Exactly the same day. Great. Well, it's wonderful to see you again, Katie. Katie, I should say, was a student of mine a long time ago at the University of Nottingham Masters, and now she's become a very eminent professor in her own right. So thank you, Katie. We look forward to reading the book.
Great. Thanks very much, Neil.